Hello YouTube, welcome back to our Space Marine Gravis Captain series. We are at last in the final episode of the series. We, as I said previously, got a lot of the bulk work done in those first 3 episodes. And so this episode we're going to be focusing on just kind of finishing up. There's a lot of small jobs to do, a lot of things that individually don't take a very long time. And that really is how I like to work through a miniature. I like to do all of the big, lengthy, time-consuming jobs first, and then go through to the smaller little bits and get them tied up all together at the end. So in today's episode we're going to be covering a little bit of freehand, showing you my way of doing it, which is a bit different. I admit it's not the most orthodox method of doing freehand, but you might pick up something from it. We're then going to be looking at some battle damage and weathering. We're going to be looking at some little details around the miniature, such as purity seals, that kind of thing, and then finishing up with some basing. So there's quite a lot to get through in today's episode. I don't want to waste any time, so let's get down to down count. Okay, so to kick things off, we're going to be going with some whites. It's kind of your choice what ones you use. These are the 2 that I like. Some people like to start off their freehand from like a grey and then work up to a white. The other thing you're going to notice here is there's no pre-sketching on the miniature. Now, that is very much a choice. You often will want to pre-sketch when you're doing freehand. It's not always the best idea to just do what I've done here and go in and start kind of freestyling shapes off the top of your head. But I really wanted to illustrate what you can do just on a whim. Usually if you're planning and you've sort of pencil sketched your freehand in first, you're looking for a very specific thing, and that's why you've done that. And I think we're all kind of familiar with that technique of just using a mechanical pencil to mark out what we want to do and then go over it with line work. In this case, I'm kind of just trying to put some nice posh looking patterns on the piece. You know, I just want the cape to look a bit more expensive, so I want some cool flowy patterns. And with that in mind, I sort of felt like it was better to kind of just flow with it a little, just play around with some lining and see where I got. So you're going to see me just kind of carefully lining in shapes and making decisions. And when I'm happy with the positioning of a line, you'll see me sort of run a second line over it to firm it up. And it's all just a kind of sketching process. And I think that's because the main important thing that I'm looking to convey here is not so much how you approach planning your freehand, but more the execution of it. You'll notice that I'm right on the tip of the brush at pretty much every point in this process. And I'm trying to keep the brush as close to 90 degrees to the area that I'm painting as the shape of the miniature will allow. That's not always possible, but if you can try to remember that, that's going to really help. And as you're going to see here now, corrections are not a problem if you don't like the way something looks. Here I was really not sure of what I'd done, so I just came in with a dark green that I'd colour matched by eye to the shade value of the cape, and just started kind of making these little corrections and saying, okay, maybe we can modify this a little bit. Maybe we can just move some of these shapes around, tidy some of them up a little bit, and get to something that we're happy with. And I'm looking at the piece now, kind of working out where I went wrong with that pass, what I should or shouldn't have done. And I'm trying to just kind of replan now on the fly. And this is why I don't think the pencil sketch is super necessary all of the time, because it is very easy to just make these corrections. So now you see I've kind of looked at this and said, okay, I think I know what I want to fix now. So I just go back to my white, and then I say, no, I'm still not happy. I'm just going to say bollocks to it and delete a big old chunk. And you can see that now I've done that with the shade colour and just drawn in a nice neat sort of wing-like shape that I'm much happier with. Now we go on to some blood drips. Now this is an important thing to watch out for. You can see my paint is spreading here, and that's because I had a layer of matte varnish on the top of the miniature, and my paint was very, very thin. And when extremely thin paint hits matte varnish, it does have a habit of bleeding out. So something to really watch out for. You need your paint super thin for freehand. It really does need to be about as thin as you can bear for it to be. But if you've got matte varnish on the surface, you may be subject to some spreading, which could be annoying. So just watch out for that. You can see we're just planning in a couple of blood drips here and there. A little bit of white now. And again, I'll make some mistakes on these and we'll go back and fix it. It doesn't matter. Freehand is not something to be scared of. Let yourself make a few mistakes and then just go back and fix it. Some Mephiston red now. What I'm going to do here is, this is to start correcting mistakes. I'm going to start off with thinned down Mephiston red, just to kind of neaten the edge lines of stuff. But then I'll start adding in bits of black and white to colour match it to the areas of highlight that are around it, or the areas of shade that are around it. And I'll start to just kind of rub back into those corrective lines, just to make them blend into the existing work that's already on the miniature. I also took this as an opportunity to just play with the overall highlighting in some of those areas a bit. When you've got the context of a big white bit of freehand on there, it can be, you know, you can start to see something that you maybe wouldn't have seen before in the shading or highlighting. And so now's as good a time as any to make a little adjustment. And again, that goes back to that thing that I've been saying through the whole series. It should be an ongoing process. Nothing should be considered done until you're happy to consider it done. And so if you get to the stage where you're doing the freehand and you say, oh, actually, you know, these highlights should be a bit brighter. They don't look bright enough against this really bright white freehand. Just go in and fix it. It's absolutely fine to do so. Getting on to the Blood Angels insignia now in black. And again, I was having some spreading problems here. There's actually one point in this where I really thought I'd screwed it up because I was having some spreading issues. And I felt like it was all the more important to actually leave that in this video so that you could see, you know, the attitude of don't panic and just go back in and keep working at it. So you see now I'm sort of colour matching to my highlight colour and then to my shade colour, so that as I correct these shapes, I can make sure that the corrective lines match what's around them. Here's the part where I have a huge spread that really scares me, to be honest, just there. That came out way thicker than I intended it to, and I was really, really worried when I first looked at it. I had a Blood Angels icon up. There's another one. I had a Blood Angels icon up on my other screen, and at the point that I made those couple of big blobby mistakes there, I was sort of glancing at it and going, shit, can I fix this? Can I fix it? Turns out you can fix it. It's even, you know, even having to teach myself not to panic, because as long as you just reline around stuff to shape it back to how you want it, it's pretty easily done to get things looking smart again. So you see now I'm just starting to dot in with colour matched reds and fix up the shape of everything, make it look like a Blood Angels insignia. And you can already see it's starting to look the part now. It's getting way closer, just for a few little corrections. We're not talking about hours of work here either, you know, this is a matter of minutes. Okay, now I'm starting to just put some dark grey into the top half of that insignia, and then we'll start to build a grey highlight, just so that you have to think, this is painted onto a shoulder pad, but it's highlighted already, so it needs to be highlighted with that to stay in line and look like a part of it. So as I start to finish off defining the shape, I'll also start adding a highlight into the upper half of this and just kind of trying to make it look like it belongs in situ with the shoulder pad underneath it. There's a bit more grey now, getting a little bit lighter, and a bit lighter still. And a bit lighter still. And even lighter still. Oh, we didn't come to play. There we go. A really bright grey just to finish up a few little points on that. And I love how that ended up looking. Okay, that's the freehand down. So now we're going to start getting onto some of those little accessories around the miniature. Purity seals, which I'm doing green. You can see from various parts of the miniature that I've used green as a tie-in colour. That's something I started doing back when I painted my Primaris Mephiston, so it's kind of a thing that I have to do for my army to keep everything consistent. You certainly don't have to paint your purity seals green like I've chosen to, but it's a really good accent colour against red, whereas the sort of purples or reds that you typically see them in doesn't work. So we're going to be going around with the same Boreal green, which is on the inside of the cape and on the power sword, and starting to tackle those purity seals now, and just a few other little small details. Let's get back to down cam. Right, I think it's about time we talked about purity seals. So we're starting off with a base coat just of Boreal green, same colour we used previously to do the sword and the cloak. Just nipping around them, and then starting to highlight just with Boreal green mixed with skeleton bone. Again, exactly as we did with the cloak. You can see it's a very, very simple, just dotted highlight, super straightforward. Next for the eyes, again starting with pure Boreal green and just adding skeleton bone to that to build up highlights again. Nothing particularly complicated going on here. When I get to the point of doing the reflection, I want a highlight going towards the back of the eye lens, but I want a reflection towards the front of the eye lens, and that's just to kind of show the light passing through the lens. So as the light's going into the lens at the front, it's going to leave a bright point of reflection, but as it's coming back out the lens at the back, because that lens is a curved surface, it's going to be a little bit brighter towards the back. So I tried to just get a nice sort of pinpoint highlight towards the front of it, and a nice bright kind of exit highlight, I guess, towards the back of it. Getting into the parchment now, these are the three colours I'll be using: Muddy Brown, Woodland Brown, Skeleton Bone, all from Reaper Master series. Starting off with the Muddy Brown, just a base coat all over them, leaving just the crack between each one in the sort of black that it was already painted in. You notice this one that's red, because it's in an area that's brightly lit, I didn't even bother with the black line in between it. I just left the whole thing and went in with brown. Moving up to the Woodland Brown now, we start to just kind of dot in highlights, keeping them kind of jagged, and I like to use sort of horizontal lines a lot when I do parchment. I feel like it gives a kind of impression of crinkliness to the paper. So as I start to build up highlights, I'll use a lot of horizontal lines. I'm also just getting the bones in the little middle bit done there and the scroll, because it's all the same colours, so you may as well do the workups together. You'll notice that there's a very short purity seal just below his hand there, and that's just because this is actually an eBay rescue and it was snapped, and I didn't really feel the need to sculpt it back in. I kind of thought to myself, well, you know, in the heat of battle, a purity seal could quite easily get torn. Like, why would there not be a short, tattered one hanging somewhere? So I just left it. Anyway, continuing now with a mixture of Woodland Brown and Skeleton Bone. We don't go straight up to pure Skeleton Bone, that is our final highlight, but we are sticking to those kind of horizontal lines on the parchments, and just angling towards the sort of tips and tops and bottoms on the bones. Brightening that colour again a little bit, just a bit more Skeleton Bone into it. We're still not at pure Skeleton Bone yet. And now we're at pure Skeleton Bone. You can see really just tickling the very, very tips of areas. Very, very little paint. I may have added a touch of white to the Skeleton Bone there, just because I wanted a few more super, super bright highlights. Sometimes you'll make little ad hoc decisions like that on the fly. And then the black, touching up a few bits in the middle. Some grey to highlight those. The part that everyone dreads, doing the writing. I've zoomed the camera in here so you can see what I'm doing. Just the very last hair of the brush, really gentle, squiggly horizontal lines. I see a lot of people do these and they're way too thick. You're really trying to think about what writing would look like at scale. You do want to be right on the very last hair or two of the brush. Oh, I appear to have an intruder. This is going to make filming difficult. You don't care, do you? You don't care at all. This is Trevor. So next up we're going to be using some StynilRez black primer here, just because it shows up a bit more black than my matte black paints. And we're going to be starting to look at battle damage, wear, and all that kind of stuff. So I actually use a method very similar to the legend that is Mr. Darren Latham. I watched his battle damage tutorial, really liked his approach, and so I kind of incorporated that into my own style. I do kind of toy with it a little bit. I know that mine doesn't look exactly the same as his, but I couldn't even tell you myself exactly what it is that I do differently. So we're just touring around the miniature now and just adding some little dings in the ceramite, scratching things up a little bit, making it look like he's been in wars, as he rightly should be, hitting every area, making sure that we're thorough. Then a bit of pink. This is Mephiston red and skeleton bone, just to put a highlight on the bottom of each of those scratches. You have to be consistent with this in order for it to look right. It requires the context of the areas around it in order to be successful as a look, so you have to always highlight on the bottom of every little scratch and ding. If you even put one with the highlight on the top of it, all the other scratches that are around it will look weird. So you want to be always shooting for the bottom of the mark. Getting some Mephiston red again now, just to rough up some of the painted icons, the free-handed bits. And then into some woodland brown mixed with matte varnish. The matte varnish actually ends up being a bit of a non-issue here, but my thought behind adding it was just that I want this to look like kind of, or at the time I wanted it to look like kind of dried dirt that had kind of splashed up around him. So we went through the airbrush with this, and it's very, very thin, very transparent, and we're just building it up slowly, rotating the miniature. I later decided to do something which you will see towards the end that sort of negated part of this process, but I really wanted that look of there to be a bit of built up dirt and grime on the guy. As I've said previously, I love very grimdark Space Marines, so I tend to always go for effects and approaches that pertain to that. You can see I'm just building this up on all the lower sections of the miniature. Now I'm going to take exactly the same colour from the cup of the airbrush and actually just dot on some mud splashes. The reason I'm using the same colour is just because I want it to blend kind of seamlessly into the more intense parts where there's a lot of mud built up and just kind of creep out of it slowly. So using a very similar brush technique to how I did the battle damage in the first place, just adding little streaks and splashes of mud in areas where I think they would be likely to pick up. Alright, so the miniature himself, basically done at this point. There's one last little step that I'm going to do at the end, which you will see in the 360. But we're pretty much done with the captain himself now, after getting all of those little details added. So, the last thing to do is look at that base. Now, I'm not a super expert when it comes to basing, I'm going to be honest. A lot of the level ups that I've made in basing have probably come from paying attention to a guy called the Bug King on Instagram and Twitch. He's an absolutely fantastic baser, and I picked up a bunch of tips from looking at his work. but in all honesty, I tend to, for my own army at least, just do fairly simple bases. So my Blood Angels are themed to be on a kind of muddy, snowy sort of world. The idea being that they're campaigning on some kind of winter world, and you know, because of the drudge of war, everything getting kind of trodden down and turning slushy and thawing and then refreezing and all that kind of thing, there's sort of mud and snow everywhere. So I'm just going to show you a fairly straightforward, fairly simple way to do a muddy, snowy base with a few rocks on it and stuff, and then we'll be all wrapped up. So finally the base, I'm going to start off here with a sort of space wolfy grey kind of colour, fairly thin, and just overbrush it onto everything. I've just glued sand and rocks to this base, very typically as you normally would. Use my pin vice drill to knock a hole through one of the stones for the guy to be glued into. Brightening up that colour now, just some skeleton bone added into it. I think this was the heather blue that I used in a previous video, that was the base for this. Now, with the muddy colour that's still in my airbrush, I'm now starting to just add a very acute angled spray to sort of generate a bit of visual interest, kind of add some brown into this bluiness. Brown and blue as a contrast together looks so good. Next up, I'm going to grab a nice bright highlight and just sort of start to paint a bit of texture into these rocks. You'll notice I'm not allowing any drying time with any of this either. When it comes to really sort of natural formations like this, I quite like the paints to kind of start blending into each other and sort of going under and over each other and creating all these weird complex layers, because nature kind of has a lot of these odd complex colours in it that sometimes the best way to emulate them is to just kind of let go a bit and let your paints mix straight on the miniature. That's stage one. Then we're going to clip our guy off of the pin that he's been painted on. I should show that at some point. It's just a little triangle made out of a paper clip, and then I bend part of it upwards and pin it into the bottom of the miniature. And it creates a little base that you can fix with some glue tack to your hobby holder. I'm just using some super glue, CA glue, whatever you prefer to call it, cyanoacrylate if you're Adam Savage, and gluing in, and then some dabs just to make sure that it's nice and strong, and a bit of CA activator. This is Zip Kicker, which I picked up from Harlequins in Preston. Really good CA activator. They kind of all work the same, but he's nice and firm on there now. And because we've got him nice and firm on there now, we can move straight on to the next stage, no waiting around. So crappy old brush, some Vallejo snow texture, and start really liberally slapping that about. Not being particularly careful, because snow kind of, when it's in that sort of starting to thaw phase, which is how I wanted this, kind of just melts and sits wherever it feels like, really, or does what it wants. Been quite liberal in some areas, more sparing in others. I like there to be a bit of variance. We're built up really evenly. And again, while that's still wet, we are going to come in for the next process. I'm going to grab, this is some muddy brown around the rim of the base, and then I believe it's woodland brown that I'm going to switch to in just a second. Quickly get a ring of muddy brown on there, and then this is a very, very thinned down. I think this is actually muddy brown, but very, very thinned down. And just kind of letting it smear into that snow texture. The snow texture it has a white paint base to it, so you can kind of let paint bleed into it. Some Vallejo acrylic water texture next. This is to just create some shiny sort of icy looking patches. Again, I'm going for thawed snow here, or thawing snow, so there needs to be some sort of icy patches. This just creates some little glossy spots. And with that, we have our completed piece. Now, I did decide right at the very last minute with this to come in with some satin varnish. I tend to usually lean more towards matte miniatures, but I thought satin would look great for this one, just for the armour and to keep the blacks looking as black as possible. I actually really love how this turned out, so I hope you like it. And there you have it. After 4 weeks of tutorials and so much learning for me, we have got to the end of our Blood Angels Captain. Now, when I talk about learning for me, it's an interesting part about the dynamic of the relationship between a content creator and his audience. I find that when I make videos like this and I have to really map out the thought process as to how and why I'm doing things, that it kind of gives me pause for thought and sort of helps cement little bits of information into my brain. And so these exercises where I'm showing you how I do things and hoping that you may be able to learn something from them, or that you may be able to adapt those techniques and turn them into something of your own, they're as much a learning process for me, and that's really a fantastic feeling. In fact, the miniature that I painted immediately after that captain felt like a huge level up for me, and the miniature after that felt like a level up again. One thing that is really important with all of this that you take away from it is that when you're looking at another painter's methods of painting, you shouldn't necessarily be looking to exactly replicate what they're doing. And that's why you'll notice often with my instructions I can be a little bit vague. And that's because I'm not really trying to persuade anyone to do exactly what I do. What I'm trying to do is encourage an internal dialogue where you can examine something that I'm doing, take a look at that, and have a think about how you might want to do the same thing. And I really hope that that's come across in this series, because it's been a fantastic journey for me, and I'm really, really grateful to everybody that's gotten behind this series and that has been subscribing to the channel and watching. I'm going to get myself out of here now, but I really hope that you enjoyed this series. The next video we will be going back to some 2D art. I've got a little something in the works for you, and I hope that you'll enjoy it very much. So I will see you in that one, YouTube. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It matters so much.